Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about literature and culture in this snowy and rocky and sometimes flat land that we call Canada.
Curl up with a good book in front of the fireplace, chill out.
Yeah, I wish I could do that more often, but I don't have a fireplace.
Neither do I. I mean, what new places that are built do have fireplace?
New ones, no, it's very rare, especially here in Montreal. I think there's a law against it.
Yeah.
No, I don't think you actually can. I don't know.
Which is fine.
Anyway, today we're here. Oh, by the way, Mac's here. My name is Patrick, and this is Mackenzie, the Scooby-Doo expert of the show. Self-proclaimed Scooby scholar.
The Scoobers and the Doobers.
Today, we're going to be talking about, I think we're mostly going to be talking about the idea of French-Canadian nationalism as it was emerging in the late 19th, early 20th century. But we're also going to be talking a little bit about a book that was also published around this time that I think is interesting to think about in parallel with this idea, called The Seats of the Mighty, which was published in 1896. And as with all our books, or most of the books that we talk about, is linked in the description if you want to follow along. Before we get started, though, quick shout out to all our patrons who help, support the show. So we have Craig, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, Belinda, Noah, and Paula, who all help support us in their own way. And yeah, thank you very much. If you want to help the show monetarily, you can do that on Patreon. And right now, you actually have early access to the latest interview that I conducted, which is going to be released in a few weeks on the regular channel. But if you want to have access to it early, that could be something that might be interesting. And probably next week, we'll do a Pop Canada episode as well. So
yeah, one for the new year.
Exactly.
Scooby-Doo's history with Canada.
Yeah. God damn it. I hope that's not a thing.
Anyway.
So, Mac, if you hear the words French-Canadian nationalism, what do you think of? Whether it's in the 19th century or not? Like, what comes to mind?
I was raised, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. So.
Interesting. Okay. But in all seriousness, like, is there a diplomatic way that you could perhaps express your sentiments vis-a-vis?
Honestly, of like the French-Canadian nationalism? Like, I don't know. It's just one of those things that's woven into Canada. You can't talk about Canada without talking about it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just,
okay.
Yeah, I don't know what I know. It's just hard for me to articulate because you can't really say it's good or bad. It's just a thing that's always been there. It's always been a part of something. It's one of those things everybody's gonna have an opinion on, and even if you go to fucking Vancouver, people are gonna be like, oh yes, Quebec, those guys.
And that's not to say that there aren't other nationalist movements within Canada, right?
No,
we see it with in the West right now in Alberta. You see that kind of rhetoric also being emerging. But that's the one that arguably emerged the earliest in Canada, or one of, as far as mainstream Canadian culture is concerned. And yeah, do you think that it's, however, consistent as a movement since the 19th century, like the idea of French-Canadian nationalism?
Since the 19th century?
Yeah. Because I would argue that it kind of emerged then, but do you think it's been a consistent movement?
It emerged as soon as the French lost the 7 Years' War.
Yes, but it was more vocal starting in the 19th century is what I mean. Like, it was more cohesive. Yeah, absolutely.
And 100%. That's where it started. Again, people most famously think of the 20th century, but that's not necessarily true.
No. And I think people think of the 20th century or mid 20th century as that emerging because I think of the seeds that we're going to be talking about today, right? That will kind of carry over and evolve into a different type of French-Canadian nationalism that is specifically centered around Quebec, right? Because it's not the same thing. right? French Canadian is not necessarily the same thing. It's often associated with Quebec, but it's not exclusively the same thing.
Technically the same.
Right. So yeah, basically today I wanted to talk about three things. I wanted to talk about the national anthem, because I think that relates into what we're talking about. I want to talk about a figure called Henri Bourassa. And I want to talk about the novel that we were talking about later, which is not written by a French Canadian, but I think offers a good counter posing to what we're going to be talking about now. Just out of curiosity, getting into this first topic, what do you know about the national anthem, its writing and where it came from, its origins?
Oh boy, I have vague recollections. It's been through a couple of drafts, a couple of editions. It was, I think I remember we talked about it on Pop Canada a little bit when we were talking about Canada
We might have
Day.
briefly talked about it. Yeah.
So there's that part, but then I also know the more modern debate about it.
Okay.
And then how it's, what was where people are contesting the use of sons or something, boys,
sons. I think God as well might have been a contested
one.
Yeah,
God is. But I think the big one was the sons and men and boys of Canada, because of how it's gendered. And then people were debating, well, no, they were talking about the soldiers back in World War I who fought and gave their lives, blah, blah, blah. And there's this and there's that. And I remember that part, but I know more modern discourse, not the history of it. As it usually goes on this show, I know the modern version of these tales. You know the past.
So in itself, right, the national anthem as we know it today was only officially made in the 1980s. It was only officially made the national anthem in 1980, right, which is wild to think of, right, that we for a long time our national anthem would have been God Save the Queen, actually, but the song that was or God Save the King. Yes. But the actual, despite it only being official in 1980 under the Trudeau government, the actual song of O Canada was written and first published in the 1880s, right? So, and there were all kinds of other songs that had been written that were nationalistic in bent. So a lot of the English Canadian songs actually were quite British in origin, right? We often, as with God Save the Queen or King, just took from the so-called motherland and just repurposed it for Canadian affairs. There were obviously some songs like The Maple Leaf Forever, which was very popular in English Canada and was written the same year as Confederation happened. I think we talked about that one before. So that obviously was a thing, right? But what you see, interestingly, is that from the 30s or late 1830s onward, you do see a rise in the number of French Canadian songs specifically, right? But they did not necessarily proclaim themselves in the same way that we would today, right? As far as French Canadian discourse goes, right? Because if you look, a lot of them would just claim themselves as Canadian. It was in French, but they called themselves Canadiens, right? Which I think is indicative of the state of French Canadian nationalism, right, at the time, right? It's not that they were wholly separate from English Canada. It's just we are French speakers within Canada, right? And I think that's an important distinction to make, right? And why we're qualifying this as French Canadian nationalism rather than specifically Quebec nationalism, for example. I don't know if you had anything to add about that so far, but
no, you're right. It is an important discussion distinction to make because we forget places like Acadia, for example, most famously, probably.
Yeah. Or
and this idea that there are other French Canadian colonies, because people forget New France stretched all over North America. It was one of the biggest fucking territories. It went down to Louisiana, didn't it?
Pretty much modern Louisiana, yeah.
Yeah. That's why in Louisiana there are French-speaking people. So there's an important distinction to be made there, that when we speak of French Canadian nationalism, there's a lot going on. There's a lot that we can talk about again. So, and in some ways, there might be more to relate with some of these people in Louisiana if we really wanted to.
Probably, yeah. Although that culture kind of emerged differently as with slave cultures and stuff like that. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
So it's a distinction that should be made. And again, I didn't make that distinction myself at the top of the episode when I should. But yeah, it's part of that. But we've been conditioned, I think, more recently to very much link French Canadian nationalism to Quebec. We've been conditioned on both sides of the aisle. People for and against Quebec nationalism have both sort of, again, in pure Canadian fashion, sweep the other parts under the rug.
Well, I think part of that is because of, one of the things we'll talk about later with Henri Bourassa, right? His manifest antagonism against some of the regulations that we've talked about before when we were talking about education rights, right? In Canada, right? Where a lot of English speaking provinces just didn't offer or didn't encourage French education as well as a minority right. And so it would inevitably have an impact on the number of French speakers over time, right? So despite it being obviously a problem that, other French speaking populations are not acknowledged, I can understand the historical background why that idea would emerge, right? Because in other provinces, it wasn't necessarily as protected or as encouraged. But yeah, except in New Brunswick, where, officially they're a bilingual province. Officially.
Aren't all... Wait, so all provinces aren't officially bilingual?
No, so Canada is officially a bilingual country, but each individual province has their official language. So Quebec has its official language as French, but New Brunswick has its official language as both, and all of the other provinces, it's just English.
We should be a bit more like everybody should be a bit more like New Brunswick in that matter.
You'd think, but
it would solve a lot more issues.
They're too small for anyone to care about it.
Represent New Brunswick, I dig it.
No, but honestly though, I agree with you. Just the very fact of encouraging people to speak as many languages as possible, I think is a good thing. But hey, that's just me. But just a few examples of other songs that were made before the national anthem was written. So you had, for example, Vive la Canadienne, the Canadian, A French Air, both of which were written in the 1840s and 1850s. The latter example was recognized upon its publication as, quote, a mélodie nationale canadienne, so a national Canadian melody, basically. And other writers like Octave Crémazie, who we've talked about on the show before, wrote things like Le Drapeau de Carillon, Légende canadienne in 1858, which was set to music later. And that was very popular as a song that kind of spoke to the Canadiens, right? French Canadians. And, even people who were important to Confederation, like Georges-Étienne Cartier, who we've talked about as well, right? Wrote songs like Au Canada, mon pays, mes amours, right? So you have this explicit link between Canada and French culture. The actual O Canada song that we know today was also written by a francophone, right? By the name of Calixa La Vallée, which at first I thought was a woman, just based on the name, but that's my own assumption. But no, he was not. But that song actually came out in 1880, so a good 100 years before it was actually made into the official national anthem. And so Calixa La Vallée actually composed the music, and the words were written by Adolphe Basile Routier, right? And it was specifically commissioned, funny enough, for the French Canadian national holiday, the Saint Jean-Baptiste holiday, right? Which I think is interesting to note, right? And I'm curious what you make of that, right? That what started off as like a explicitly French Canadian holiday song was eventually turned into Canada's entire national anthem. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I think it's kind of cool to at least note.
It is. It's interesting. Cool. It's neat.
Okay. That's it. Just neat. Okay. But it actually was quite immediately popular as a song. So it was first performed on June 24th in 1880. And it took about 20 years before other provinces started to embrace that particular song. And that's where you start to see translations of it emerge, right? Funny enough, if you look up the actual lyrics for the 1880 version in French, it's the same freaking lyrics as we have today. The French version has never changed, which I don't know, I think is kind of interesting. that there's this kind of inherent conservatism in the nationalism, or like there are national ideas, right? Yeah, which might seem obvious.
The national movement is inherently conservative, Patrick?
Yeah, as surprising as it may seem, like, yeah. But I just feel like it's interesting to see that through song in this case, right?
I think you're going to see that a lot with cultures. How they do or do not change is very reflective of their political.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting that you brought up the fact that the modern day national anthem was kind of subject to revision, right? And, okay, people wondering if we should keep sons or not. The English version went through already a lot of revisions from the get-go, right? It changed every few years. Like there were a bunch of rewritings and translations. So it's weird to me that there wouldn't, that people would be so stuck up about it now, considering the fact that it was never a stable thing, right? Contrary to the French version. Like, I don't know why. Yeah, I don't know what it is with the obsession in the English version to constantly change, but yeah.
I think that just comes from a bunch of different things, and the idea like English is the most prevalent language, but that's because a lot of people speak it as their second language. So it means that a lot of other cultures adopt English, which brings a lot more perspectives. There are not a lot of people adopting French, no matter how hard the government can.
Yeah, or at least not not immediately. We'll say it like that, because people do adopt it when they stay here. But yeah, it's not as prevalent, I would say. But yeah, just looking at, because I think one of the things as well is that the French version is surprisingly neutral in terms. You mentioned the idea of gender, right, with sons, for example. The French version, if anyone knows it of our listeners, is surprisingly neutral in that respect, because it refers to ton histoire and ta valeur. So it's always in the second person, right? Which adds a kind of generality to it that never existed in the French, in the English version, right? Because we added words like sons and so on.
We dare add the sons.
Yeah. So it's interesting to note that, I guess. Lavallée actually is kind of interesting as a figure. We're not going to talk much about him, but he would actually spend more time in the US, despite his, despite him actually being quite proud of his French Canadian heritage by all accounts, and being quite respected as a musician in Canada. He was one of the first professional musicians fully raised and trained in Canada. And there are actually prizes named after him. The Prix de la Musique Calix à la Vallée, which was awarded by the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society of Montreal, that originally commissioned his thing, his song, is named in his honor, right? So he is well known in French Canada and well respected. But despite that, he would actually spend more time in the US, and was actually a Union Army officer during the American Civil War, and was an advocate of Canadian annexation to the US, which is, it's just a bunch of weird contradictions.
Yeah, but it just goes to show how much we can overlook certain aspects of a person in favor of others.
Yeah, but I think we've talked about this before. It's not the first time that we see French Canadians, or people that are proud to be French Canadians, advocate for US annexation, right? Because there's this perception that the US is a more fragmented country, right? With more states' rights. And so if Canada, for example, would join in the US, places like Quebec or French Canadians would be allowed to have more autonomy within a more American framework. So he's not alone in this sense, right? If you'll recall, when we talked about Papineau, he had a similar idea for a while, right? He also advocated for American annexation, which I don't agree with, but I can see the logic behind it.
Of annexing Canada.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that.
No, neither am I.
Just laying it out there. But yeah, despite its official status not being secured, by the First World War, it seems like O Canada had become the de facto national anthem in French Canada, but was also popular in English Canada, but not as popular as something like the Maple Leaf Forever, right? So yeah, you kind of had these two national anthems, so to speak, unofficial national anthems, that eventually, was just history, I guess. And no one talks about the Maple Leaf Forever now.
Oh no, not the Maple Leaf Forever. I guess it really wasn't forever the Maple Leaf.
Wah, wah.
Wah, wah.
Do you have anything to add about the national anthem or anything that we mentioned here before we move on to Henri Bourassa?
Not about the old national anthem. We can save talking about the modern version.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I probably, when we eventually get to Pierre Trudeau, we'll talk about it because it was under his government that happened. Or we can make an episode of Pop Canada about it. I don't know. Could do something. But yeah, I assume we'll talk about it eventually. So when I say the name Henri Bourassa, what comes to mind?
When I say Henri Bourassa, the metro station.
I knew it. I fucking knew it.
Listen, I'm sure it's gonna be for a fair amount of people.
Yep. So for those who are not listening from Montreal, there is a metro station named after him on the very end of the Green Line. Yeah. Exactly. But do you know anything about the actual figure himself, like why there's a metro station named after him?
Oh God, no. Are you kidding me?
And why
high school history class conditioned me to have Quebec history go in one year and write out the other when I didn't need it anymore.
And how he would probably hate you for pronouncing his name Henry and not Henri.
I know. That's the one thing I can probably know, so that's why I'm going to do it a lot.
But the reason why I bring him up is that he kind of fits in, at least at first, in the start of his career, he kind of fits in with what we're talking about as emblematic of French Canadians as Canadiens, right? And
your face is emblematic of French Canadians as Canadiens.
Yeah, but you see what I mean of like, insofar as like he wasn't advocating necessarily independence of Quebec or other French ethnicities, right? But rather just acknowledging the French character or Francophone character of a country like Canada.
It's really weird how that got expanded upon and exaggerated into what it became today.
You'll see why, I think. Like you'll see the seeds of how that became that, I would say, right? In his career, right? So Bourassa himself was actually the grandson of Louis-Joseph Papineau, right? So there is a kind of, nationalistic lineage going on there, or anti-British lineage going on in that family. And he was born in Montreal, which is again another connection to the metro station that you know. And he quickly developed apparently a taste for journalism and politics at a young age. By 22, he was actually the mayor of the town of Montebello, which people probably don't know the name just off the top of their head, but that's where one of the biggest rock festivals in Canada happens, the Rockfest. So that's its claim to fame now.
There you go.
Although I doubt the Rockfest happened in 18 whatever when he was
when
mayor.
Rock and roll wasn't even a thing.
Hey, the fiddle can rock the hell out of a scene.
Oh, I'm sure, but just not roll too.
You can either rock or you can roll at the time. You can't do both.
It wasn't until we got into the House of the Rising Sun that we learned both.
It's thanks to Chuck Berry that he was able to roll around with a guitar. Anyway, so very quickly, he also became the editor of a Franco-Ontarian paper called L'Interprète, which again points to French community outside of Quebec in this case. And in 1896, he would enter into the House of Commons as a Liberal member of Parliament, right, for the sector of Labelle. Now, this would be under the Wilfrid Laurier administration in this case, which I think is important because just because he was part of that government does not mean that he supported it, right? And you'll see this because arguably Henri Bourassa would be one of the reasons why the Laurier government would fail eventually, right? And we'll get into that obviously when we talk about Laurier, but a little bit here as well, right? He, like his adherence to his own principles would start to show in 1899 more coherently because he would oppose Canadian participation in the Boer War or the Second Boer War at this case. And in part because Parliament had not been consulted in this decision. It was just a fait accompli, so to speak, that, well, because it's a British war in South Africa, well, obviously Canada is going to be a part of it. And so he was actively against that. He actively did not support the automatic joining of British imperialism by Canada, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think is an important part of that movement, right? French Canadian movements, is that they weren't necessarily against the idea of Canada, but they were against the idea of not being autonomous, right, as a country, right? And as French speakers, they were able to like have that kind of leverage. I don't know. Sorry, I think you wanted to say something.
It's just, it's always been what people in Canada and groups in Canada have been after for, is most of the time they just want recognition.
Right.
Like 9 times out of 10, they don't even want they don't want like a lot of power or anything like that. They just want people to go, hey, you're a thing. Like, yeah, French Canada is part of Canada. It's important. Like it boggles. It really baffles, boggles, and bagels the mind that you can't just give it to them. I never quite understood behind that.
Yeah. But you were talking earlier about like how it's wild that the movement that we're seeing in this period in the 19th century would emerge into what it is. Well, not really now. It's not really much of a movement, let's face it. But what it would emerge in like the later 20th century. Well, it makes sense, right? The idea of autonomy as led by, in this case, a French Canadian, once Canada actually did get its autonomy as an entity from the British Empire, once the British Empire kind of went by the wayside, well, who do you have to go up against? Well, Canada as a system, right? So
fight the system, the evolution, fight the power.
I mean, yeah.
Next thing you know, Quebec's going to get its independence, and then it's going to be a bunch of city-states vying for their own autonomy. Montreal's going to want to split off and become the country of Montreal.
Isn't there a party that advocates for that?
Fuck, probably. There's a party for everything. There's a party that wants to give everybody a rhino, okay?
Oh, God. I wouldn't say no. But anyway.
What would I do with this?
Ride around. I don't know. It's a fat unicorn. What wouldn't you do with it?
Anyway.
But yeah, so getting back to Mr. Bourassa. So this whole debacle about the Boer War would actually lead him to resist, as I was saying, Laurier and British imperialism writ large. And as a kind of protest, he would resign from his post, but the people would not let him do so, and he was reelected as an MP eventually. But as a power move, I think it's kind of, notable. It's being like, no, the actual representatives of government don't support this decision, and he and other people would just resign. But the fact that he was reelected, I think, does show the importance that he held for a lot of the population that saw in him a kind of new voice that hadn't really existed since Confederation had started, right? And I think that's important, right? In 1902, he would publish what is kind of his touchstone pamphlet in this case, which is available for free online. Although it's, I think, just in French. I don't think there's an English translation of it.
Shocking.
It's called Grande-Bretagne et Canada, so Great Britain and Canada. And it would cause quite a stir at the time, right? And that's really where he was kind of born as a French Canadian idol, right? So to speak. Like intellectually, it was sound. It was able to, like, the actual rhetoric was very powerful when you actually read it. Sorry, you look like you're gonna laugh.
No. I'm thinking anyway, but I do think it's interesting, this idea of a pamphlet. It's free in French.
Yeah,
which was resistance on both sides.
Arguably, it was the memes of the time.
Right.
Like it's something that's easily.
I'm sad that this didn't get the Charles Dickens treatment and turned from a pamphlet into a novel.
What Charles Dickens pamphlet turned into a novel?
Christmas story, a Christmas Carol. I've talked about this before. It was originally a communist pamphlet.
You didn't realize it was. I forgot it was a pamphlet.
Yeah, it was like a socialist pamphlet that then turned into a story. Dickens was like social as fuck. He was
in some respects.
For his time, he was a hardcore social.
For his time, perhaps. Yeah, I can see that.
Perhaps he just was.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. But
so I'm sad that
basically,
didn't get the pamphlet.
Yeah. I mean, there are later novels that would advocate for this, so it wasn't exclusively this. It wasn't specifically this one, but that would happen eventually. Yeah, absolutely. But mostly in the 1960s onward, right? So, or actually 1940s. I would argue. We'll talk about it eventually. But basically, his program centered pretty exclusively on Canadian nationalism, mixed with a kind of Catholic-style social conservatism, right? Which I think is important as well to keep in mind, is that for a long time, while we kind of associate a lot of, French Canadian, later Quebec nationalism with actually, progressive movements for its time, right? In the 60s and 70s, there was often that kind of very progressive underlying element to it. Nationalism in this period was rather conservative, right? And deliberately so, right? Obviously, it's always conservative in a way in terms of like looking back towards an imagined past. But in this case, as you're saying, Bourassa advocated for a kind of social conservatism that very much emphasized the role of the family, the church, and so on as being an integral part of Canadian and Quebec style nationalism. So what's another integral part of Grande-Bretagne et Canada was that on top of the autonomy for Canada, he also advocated for respect and equality for the two founding peoples. Again, no one cared about Indigenous people at the time, right? So that was not even a question in this case.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, surprising as it may seem, it wasn't really a thing in the 19th century. But as far as how they imagined it, right, the two founding peoples were to be respected and put on equal footing.
Right. That was the French and the British.
Yes, exactly.
French. I love how the British are just calling themselves the founding people of Canada.
Yeah, but that's exactly it, right? It is very problematic sense, right?
Like even ignoring the First Nations issue, which is another can of worms that is not to be opened on this show because we're not the people to talk about it. It's like you're just sort of ignoring the fact that the French were literally here first and you conquered them first.
Yeah, but then like we expanded that idea, so obviously
we springboarded. Therefore, we're your founders of this idea. Okay, Steve Jobs, calm down. Wozniak is here.
I think that's a hot take. I think a lot of people would kind of say that the English are like integral to how Canada would.
Oh, I'm sure they're integral, but being integral is different than being a founder.
Fair enough. I agree with that. Okay.
Like, founding Canada as a colony, like, you came in and you stole other colonies, which again was stolen land already. But that's the part about Canada colonization that gets really, really messy, is that you've got a lot of layers of like people colonizing and imperializing on top of each other here.
Absolutely. And then there's obviously, like we mentioned, Indigenous people, but obviously any other any other type of minority group that was there as well.
Yeah,
right?
as we talked in the last episode before Christmas, all the people that came from Asia that just got fucking stepped on.
Yeah. So, that's a thing. But no, they're not considered founding. That's different.
No. And I don't think the British should be either. They should be integral, and they are like very important to the creation of Canada as a nation, but they did not found the colonies of Canada. They springboarded.
Although they did. I mean, they started colonies in the West and in British Columbia.
But then those colonies became reliant on the fact of the other colonies in the East.
Yeah, but they were
British
still
Columbia's main point was
thing.
We want a railroad to Eastern Canada because we want the shit there. We want Eastern Canada shit, build a railroad, we're in.
Okay, fine. So on top of this kind of equality for the two founding peoples, right, it was very much a rhetoric of Canada for Canadians, both culturally and economically and politically, right? That's kind of how you can sum up Henri Bourassa's position, right? Canada for Canadians, which now kind of has a problematic tint to it. But at the time, people were kind of like, wow, this is pretty inflammatory and quite interesting as an idea. And it's an idea that was mostly taken up by things like the Ligue Nationaliste Canadienne, so Nationalist Canadian League, and newspapers like Le Nationaliste. So yeah, we kind of talked about already like the two founding peoples in this case, but I want to develop a little bit, just kind of touch upon other aspects that Bourassa would be influential with, and as far as a nascent nationalist movement was concerned, because he would keep going on pretty much every front, right? He would go against Laurier's immigration policy, right, which we haven't talked about because we haven't talked much about Wilfrid Laurier on the show, but was very much a policy advocating for Eastern European immigration to the West, right, in order to settle the West. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about Ukrainians, right, on the show. But Bourassa would attack this and saying, well, you're basically going to flood the country with people who are going to learn English, and that's going to drown out any kind of French speaking. Where have you heard that rhetoric before, Mac?
Sorry, repeat the rhetoric.
That encouraging a specific type of immigration into the West from Eastern Europe and from British speaking countries will drown out any kind of French speaking in Canada, and that's a problem for Bourassa. Where have you heard that kind of rhetoric before?
That most Quebec rhetoric.
Heyo.
Most of the government of Quebec.
Yep.
Huh?
So, again, planting seeds here. Just that's just a thing, apparently, that's just going to keep going.
Yeah,
right? Go ahead.
God. It's wild to me. The ideas people have about immigration are wild, especially out here in the West.
Yeah, it's like
we're all immigrants. Fuck.
It's like from his perspective, like, again, I don't agree. I think encourage immigration from all over the world. I'm not so beholden to a specific culture, right? But I can understand from Bourassa's point of view, who is thinking within a very clearly bicultural standpoint, which was the norm at the time, right? He is thinking and going with the assumption that Canada is a bilingual country in this case, and that should be preserved or encouraged. Right? So I can understand where he's coming from. It's unfortunate that would kind of be diluted in many ways and taken into, obviously racist territories. But I can understand, if not accept, what he's talking about from this perspective. Right. And, it's within that same frame of mind that he would also advocate for continued education rights for the Catholic minority, which we talked about on the show before, in what would become the new provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan as they were being formed in 1905. Right. However, this would mostly fail, and he would just basically turn to Quebec politics, right? And he would spend the rest of his political career in Quebec's legislative assembly, right? I don't know if you had anything to add about these specific points, right, and how it fits in with Canadian nationalism, but
I think there's something very telling in failing on the federal stage, so then picking up arms within the province. That idea of going much more, again, not grassroots, because you're still part of a provincial government, but smaller, more focused change, which, as we see, is much more viable, seems to get a lot more traction.
I think when we were talking about like the shift from French Canadian to Quebecois, right, as a kind of discourse, right, when we think about French in Canada, right, I think, again, you can arguably see the seeds here when he goes from a federal level, right, in which he's protecting or arguing for the rights of all French speakers in Canada, to provincial, right? So suddenly he's speaking for one part, right?
Yeah.
And so who's there to defend necessarily the other, minority rights in the rest of Canada? And obviously there were other people. I don't want to like put Bourassa on this great man pedestal where he was the only one doing this.
We're not going to John A. McDonald him.
Right. Like, I don't think that's a valid way of looking at history, but I think he was an important force that inevitably, as he would move towards provincial politics, does focus that kind of rhetoric onto Quebec, right? And arguably, like, that would continue going forward. In 1910, he would found the newspaper that's still
19010.
Damn it.
We are in the year 19,000. Whoa.
In the future, he launches Le Devoir, right? We still don't have this paper yet, but apparently it's quite good.
God, it's like the movie that was made that's only going to be released 80 years.
Which one are you what are you talking about?
We'll talk after the show. It's a Robert Rodriguez.
Okay, that's cool. Good for Robert Rodriguez.
My Kids is a treasure.
Yeah. So Le Devoir is still a newspaper that exists today, and still carries a little bit of that hint of, being a little bit more on the progressive side of Quebec politics. Whereas, and that kind of keeps the flavor of what Bourassa was kind of stood for in many ways, especially at the time. And yeah, despite him shifting towards provincial politics, because Bourassa would ally himself with the Quebec Conservatives, right? It's estimated by historians that this would contribute to to Wilfrid Laurier's defeat in 1911 and the last time that he would actually be prime minister. Insofar as, he would put in basically a province against him, right, for his actions, which were construed by a lot of Quebecers as advocating or encouraging a kind of British imperialism or a beholding to British imperialist models. Right. And this was something we're talking a lot about Laurier here and in relation to Bourassa, but this is something that would continue throughout other prime ministers, right? With Robert Borden during the First World War, Bourassa would advocate against conscription, right? And so on. Yeah, I think that's pretty much like all there is to say about him. I just wanted to display this as a kind of flash, or at least section of history wherein this kind of nationalism is evolving and trying to find this footing, right? What would become Canadian and then French Canadian and then Quebec nationalism.
I think it's also very how distinctly against imperialism he is making his policy. If you are against the Navy, you're against imperialism. Navies are key features of any imperialistic empire,
especially at the time.
But just in general history, against the Navy was really the first step against that. And then he was against, he was fine to join World War I because he recognized not the necessity. There was no necessity to that war, but he rejects conscription, a very imperialistic method of indoctrination and propaganda. Yeah,
absolutely. And that idea of anti-imperialism, again, sowing seeds here. When you look at the rhetoric of the nationalist movement in Quebec in the 1970s, very much advocating using those same types of terms in relation to English Canada, right? English Canadian businesses are imperialistic towards French Canadian businesses. Its economy is run, Canada's economy is run, and Quebec's economy is run by English Canadians, so on and so forth. This rhetoric of imperialism would very much continue into the 1970s. All right. Finishing off here with a novel that was published around the same time that these movements were emerging, or these ideas were emerging. It's The Seats of the Mighty by Gilbert Parker.
Seats of the Mighty!
I love that title, by the way. I think it's a really good title.
It's such a rocking title. It's awesome.
Right. You would see that on
a cover of a heavy metal album or something.
Right. Exactly. The Seats of the Mighty.
It's like the final line, Yeah. Living in the seats of the mighty, and then it all fades.
So Gilbert Parker was actually a very popular writer at the time, right, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And this book in particular was actually the third highest selling book in the United States that year, which is a very rare feat. Right. In terms still
Bronze, baby.
But even still today, having a Canadian book be on a bestseller list in the United States is rare.
Oh, 100%. I'm fully saying that bronze is actually the second best thing to get, because then it's I actually got on the podium. If you're silver, you're man, I just lost out to the first place.
But bronze, you're you still have a level of satisfaction. Absolutely. But it is quite wild to think that, he would actually be that successful. And this book, right, which is set against the backdrop of the British conquest of New France, right, in the 1760s, is we'll talk about the use of the moment, I think. It's interesting, but the novel basically centers around the relationship between a British soldier named Robert Moray, who's in captivity in Quebec, in relationship with Alix Duvernay, who's a young Canadienne, right, a French Canadian woman. And throughout the novel, the lovers' happiness is threatened by the ongoing war between the British and the French. It's also threatened by the Catholic Church, because Protestants and Catholics can't possibly intermix.
Never.
And a character called Tinoir d'Alter, which is an odd name because Tinoir sounds like little black, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. Anyway, so Tinoir d'Alter, who's a kind of charming French villain who also wants Alix for himself, right? So you read parts of this novel. I did not read it in its entirety either, but I know enough about it that I can talk about it. Do you think, what do you have to say in this case about its choice of setting, right? Thinking back to, at this point, you're in the 1890s, and it's hearkening back to the 1750s, 1760s, at a moment of conquest, in order to display this romance. What are you thinking about with that?
Well, the first thought that popped to my head, it's our version of a Western.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Again, because the idea of you're thinking of a more romantic time removed by 100 years, 150 years or so. That's what we do with Western. And then, so you're trying to put this nice veneer of paint and trying to apply these grand, much larger themes to this story that probably didn't exist, especially in the case that this story it's a soldier, right? He's not a general or anything. And the very fact of the matter is, the average soldier probably didn't know or didn't give a shit.
No, exactly. Or they were just following orders.
Yeah, exactly. Again, very much like that romantic cowboy.
Right. Although the idea that the cowboy always has a little bit of freedom, right?
Because
there's no authority.
Differ for sure. And I'm not saying that they're similar themes. I'm saying the idea of it is similar to that, where we're trying to project these larger than life, very grand themes onto common characters, common everyman characters that sometimes don't reflect the true nature of the history.
Yeah, exactly. And, in this case, Parker is obviously using this relationship, or this love triangle, to use a modern term, which I don't think would have existed at the time, but using this love triangle to talk about the relationships that are happening within Canada, right? French, English, and French Canadian in this case. There's kind of been some back and forth as to agency as far as the French Canadian woman is concerned, Alix, right? Because it's unclear how much of a choice she's really given in the story. But I don't know. Have you read enough about it that you could talk a little bit about that, or more
about the story, about
her agency, the French Canadian character's agency, as far as the romance is concerned? Because it's been a kind of subject, from what I've heard, of secondary sources and so.
I mean, I probably know less than you do, but from my understanding of both the time period, the type of story that's being written, and a lot of that, I have to imagine she didn't have a lot of agency. The female is probably more than anything a plot device / symbol. She is less of a character and more of an idea.
Yeah.
Again, sort of trying to, for lack of a better term that people would use today, manic pixie dream girl almost. Her point is less to be a character and more to teach a lesson.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And throughout I think there's an argument to be made. There's a moment when the British soldier, Robert, does mention towards the end of the novel that she must make her choice out of her own heart and spirit and fight this fight alone, right? In reference to basically how she's allowed enough agency to basically choose her own oppressor, so to speak, right, between French and British. But I think that most of the novel, I would agree with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's so many like powers at play here, as we were saying, the Catholic Church that because of her relationship with the British kind of forces her into a convent, and the fact that Doltaire is quite villainous, right, and only sees her as a resource, right? The language that Doltaire uses in reference to Alix is quite how could I say, objectifying, so to speak.
More things change, more they stay the same.
No kidding. Like there was a moment again towards the end of the novel where he refers to how he's going to lift his banner over her and stuff like that, as if she's just this fertile ground on which he can plant a flag. Right. So it's like
phallic imagery.
Obviously very. Yeah, it's obviously not comfortable reading that today, but the imagery is quite
evocative. More of the story, everything has a penis. And it's a weird. I'm not even. It's only half a joke.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but funny enough.
But again, so we're talking about this character's choice, and so the idea I guess at the end of the day for this book is Robert, or she picks Robert, and that sort of aligns Quebec with Britain, right? That's the idea. That though they are French, there's a strong French-Canadian sentiment, they are still part of the British Empire, and therefore they are like aligning themselves that way.
Yes, exactly. And Robert throughout the novel is very much depicted as the better of the two men, right? He's not necessarily a villain.
I can take a guess at how that goes.
Like just in the way, and again, in terms of like talking about agency is not great for Alix in this case. But just in the way that he speaks of her is already more caring, if not less objectifying, but more caring than what Doltaire actually does, right? He refers to this love of his life as in a bit more of sweeter tones, right? And can actually have engaging conversations with them, and very much seems like the good way to go in this case. Right? And Parker in his own personal life was not above believing such things as well, that the British were very much better than the French in this case. And outside of these characters, this also shines through, right? The way that the French Canadians in general are kind of portrayed are these backwards rural people who only think of the French motherland, right? Everything, they don't have their own culture or anything like that. They're very much just pulling from imagined ideas of French greatness that are very much depicted as not existing in the colony, right? Like whatever they're hoping they might get from France, they're not getting in the colony in this case. And that's very much Parker's point, that the British will be able to bring that. Right? I wanted to talk a little bit as well about the Gothic elements of the book, right? Because you mentioned that you like that.
I enjoy stuff with Gothic. I enjoy a good Gothic tale. Absolutely. I especially enjoy how people sort of align things with Gothic. The idea of aligning horror with Gothic, which isn't necessarily true.
Right. So how would you, for people who might not imagine it, basically, like what is the difference between Gothic and horror in this case? Because I think
horror
it can be confusing.
Horror is dread. Horror is fear. Horror is like this gnawing pit in your stomach. Meanwhile, Gothic is more suspense. It's atmosphere. It's a sense of dark grandeur.
Yeah, I like that. Dark grandeur.
Because it's the idea. Gothic is the idea that darkness is not necessarily evil, but it can be just as grand. The gates of heaven the gates of hell can be just as grand as the gates of heaven, but without the interplay of morality. You're looking less at evil versus it's not good versus evil, it's light versus dark is Gothic. Gothic is the idea of light versus dark.
Absolutely. less so in the adaptation, but if people want a modern example of this, the Haunting of Hill House was a good version of like a contemporary-ish kind of Gothic.
Honestly,
Frankenstein.
Most, like we talked about a little bit before, most modern Batman tales are very much, because Batman is a very Gothic figure, but he is a force of good. Meanwhile, the Joker is a very light fan, like colorful figure, and is a force of evil. Like that is the best way to describe Gothic, separate from the idea of horror, is the idea of characters that are Gothic in nature, but that still do good things.
Absolutely.
And one of the original Gothic stories was actually like almost more of a comedy.
Which one are you talking about in this case?
Like it's like one of the first novels. I'm drawing a blank on the name at the moment, but the idea was like the Gothic castle served as like its own character, but the actual story itself was a little bit more comedic in nature. So the Gothic is more like of a setting. It's a setting more than anything. It's a set.
Are you talking about the Percy Shelley book?
No, older.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. It's not Canadian.
Nothing matters if it's not from here.
No. So you can have a lot of things that are Gothic. And again, horror can be Gothic, but it's not necessary for they're not mutually tied. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you think are the Gothic elements of this book, though? Because there's one that comes to mind quite clearly in this case that we briefly mentioned, but if you had to
anything with the church, it can be Gothic as fuck. Any church setting they were the original Gothic.
Okay, but not for this book in particular. What church are we talking about?
God, we're talking about France versus England. So we're talking about Catholics versus Protestants, aren't we?
There you go. Which one's light? Which one's dark?
Protestants are light because they're British.
Hell yeah.
Catholics are dark and evil, Gothic. And I have to imagine that there's an interesting thing to be played there with Alex. Is that how it's pronounced?
Yep.
With Alex, because she is French Canadian. So because most French Canadians, aren't they Catholic?
Yes. In this time, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And still today. But yeah, absolutely. It's, both symbolically, right? The Catholic Church plays the role of this kind of ghostly figure throughout the book, where it's not always present as a physical entity, right? As, for example, a bishop or an actual physical church. But the idea of Catholic guilt is very much in the background, right? Of this relationship, for example, between Robert and Alex, right? This thing that's haunting the back of their minds as potentially being harmful, right? Or as potentially being this source for the breakdown of this relationship, right? What's stopping the light of Robert from reaching Alex's heart, so to speak, is this dark force of the Catholic Church. Very much so. Yeah. And there's a good moment in which,
and again, it's a misuse of Gothic, again, saying that Gothic is evil.
Yeah, it's not necessarily evil, because that's why I think it is justified as Gothic, because the church itself is not seen as evil. It's just this thing that stops the lightness of
and again, there's going to be a lot of interplay there, like of having light and evil and good and dark and all these other things. So I think it doesn't, and at the end of the day, it's very semantic. It's very something only people like you and me are going to notice and care about.
Yes. And that's what this show is about. Things that we just care
about. Another modern example, Hunchback of Notre Dame. The cathedral of...
Oh, you mean the Victor Hugo novel or the movie?
The movie, like the Disney movie. The cathedral is very Gothically designed.
That's true.
It is safe haven. It is sanctuary, despite its Gothicness.
Yes. Absolutely.
All right, that just popped in.
And there's this moment actually where Doltaire himself kind of points to, I think, just that, where the church, actually no, he's referring to the convent in that moment, but he refers to the convent in which Alex is kept as a hearse, right? So, and I think that idea is quite interesting so far as, like, obviously a hearse is related to death and so on, but it's also this place where you protect, right? The convent itself is where you protect, in this case, an image of a fair maiden who's beholden to God.
A fair maiden.
But as well, right? It's, just on its most literal level, a hearse protects the coffin, right? And so on. So there is, again, this imagery of duality that does play out in what you're describing. Absolutely. Right. Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to mention that because I thought it was an interesting part that allows us to think more widely about the kind of dynamics of the novel. But
it adds to even the name of the novel is Gothic of it itself. The Seats of the Mighty.
Yeah. Honestly, it's almost like a fantasy novel.
Yeah. Well, it's using Gothic elements is actually a very good way to add atmosphere to your story. And again, Gothic isn't just gargoyles and pointed iron rod fences. There's a lot of different kind of aesthetics to Gothic. There's very distinctual American Gothic. I'm sure if you racked your brain, you could put together a Canadian Gothic.
Oh, well, arguably Margaret Atwood wrote one.
Yeah.
With surfacing.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
But it's a good visual cue to let your audience know what kind of story they are reading. Even if it's not exactly good or bad, with a Gothic setting that there are going to be some dark undertones.
That's true. Absolutely.
And I think that is a very important thing that he was trying to convey in this story and the more serious nature of it. Because at the end of the day, traditional romances are traditionally pretty light. They are not so, even the so-called greatest romance of all time, Romeo and Juliet, as at the end of the day a very light story, and it becomes dark later on because the characters take on larger meanings and themes about conflict and ideas and intergenerational conflict.
Absolutely.
So I think the use of the Gothic is a way to try and take these romantic ideas and then tie them to larger, greater themes.
I think, and this kind of also fits in with the wider idea of what the novel, I think, is trying to do in terms of displaying the interactions between French Canadians and the invading British in this case. In the very last chapter, actually towards the end of the book, almost last chapter, there's a moment, right, where the narrator, right, mentions here, it's a bit of a long passage, but I think it does display here. This is after the conquest, so it's done. The French are defeated in this case. Of Doltaire, I had heard nothing. I would seek him out when I knew of Alix. He could not escape me in this walled town. I passed on for a time without direction, for I seemed not to know where I might find the barber. Our sentries already patrolled the streets, and our bugles were calling on the heights, with answering calls from fleet in the basin. Night came down quickly. The stars shone out in the perfect blue, and as I walked along, broken walls, shattered houses, solitary pillars looked mystically strange. It was painfully quiet, as if a beaten people had crawled away into the holes our shot and shells had made to hide their misery. Now and again, a gaunt face looked out from a hiding place and drew back again in fear at sight of me. Once a drunken woman spat at me and cursed me. Once I was fired at, and many times from dark corners I heard voices crying, "Sauvez-moi, sauvez-moi, bon Dieu." Once I stood for many minutes and watched our soldiers giving biscuits and their own share of rum to homeless French peasants hovering round the smoldering ruins of a house which carcasses had destroyed. First of all, excellent writing right there.
Facts.
But I think this kind of touches upon a bit of everything that we've been saying, right, as far as the passage goes. There is that dark tone, right, quite literally referring to the broken houses as mystically strange in this case, but also referring to the soldiers, right, as being good at heart, so to speak, right, trying to give biscuits and their share of rum only to be spat at by the French Canadian, right? But yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add about this passage or anything, any other passage that, or anything else that might come to mind about this book in particular, but I just thought it was a good way of kind of capping this off. at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's an interesting discussion, and there's probably a lot more we can talk about in this book. But I do think I think it's almost ironic at the end of the day, this person saying, "Oh, but they have to make their own choice," when they're fucking around. They are saying,
"Yeah, like what choice do you actually have?"
Yeah,
when you're faced up against all of this.
It's like that idea that we are actually the idea of Quebec nationalism. Ideas. Well, if you look at what would genuinely happen, there isn't really a choice. Quebec can't really I know I'm probably going to get blasphemed and attacked by people who believe otherwise, but separation as an idea, you look at the long-term paths, and it's like it's not really a choice. Then it's an illusion of choice. There's an illusion. There's a grand illusion going on right now.
I agree. Yeah, and what I find particular is this.
It's like saying an apology as the illusion of recognition of all the horrible things that happened to the First Nation people.
Thank you. Like you're not actually changing much of a system, right? So to speak. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. But that's actually something that would come up later, however, right? And I think I would argue does come up in Bourassa a little bit when we were talking about them, is like going up against imperialism as an idea is a change of system. Right? You are actually going against what is the understood basic structure of the time. And it's the same thing for later nationalist movements in Quebec, for example, that want to advocate for sometimes, right, quite radical societal change, right? And I think that's what makes what you're seeing in the West not as potent, is because exactly what you're talking about, that's not being advocated for, right? There's not like a great societal shift that's going to happen if anything happens there, right? At least as far as like Alberta is concerned, or anything like that.
Well, I mean, he wrote his novel when?
1896. Yeah.
So we say there was no, but like 100 years later, they had a second referendum. So in that time, there was no, but as he sort of shows, over time, great shifts can happen.
Yes.
From being Henri Bourassa, who is then almost like forced to lead the federal government, go to provincial level, to this then becoming a federal issue.
Right. Absolutely. No, it's not to say that changes don't occur. I don't want to make that claim at all.
I know you're nihilistic, Patrick, but come on.
Not to that extent. But what I do want to mention, at least as well, especially with the passage that I read and throughout, this is something I think Parker does well, is, he brings up how the average person would have actually gone through a moment like this, which is not something that you get a lot of when looking at older history, right? Because we don't have a lot of, we basically have statistics about people at the time, but little else, right? Because we didn't pay attention to the common person, right? And I think that's particularly good about Parker's novel. Obviously, he's writing it from a fiction lens, but I think it's a good part of his novel that he kind of mentions that no, the average person actually did have a say in this and would have not necessarily been happy at what just happened in the conquest, right? And yeah, I don't know, like I think it's, when we think about it historically speaking, from what I've understood, the actual common person, for example, in Bourassa's time, would have mostly had to follow what the clerical elite would have kind of done for, or at least asked of them. But again, there were times in which that contradicted itself, right? But I just wanted to mention that as something that I thought was interesting in Parker's novel. I don't know if you had anything to add about that, but
no, I think that about covers it. I mean, I could talk about the symbols and the imagery, the tying of Gothicness to phallic imagery if we really wanted to, but that's neither here nor there for this novel.
How does the phallic imagery fit in with what we're like talking about?
Oh, colonialism is all about fucking phallic imagery.
Yes, it is. Yay.
It's all about putting our dicks into Mother Nature.
Quite literally at times.
Like, stabbing, mining, like there's a reason the term is raping the earth.
Yeah, no, like, and that's exactly what I was referring to. Like people who are thinking we're going off kilter here. No, this, the history of imperialism and colonialism does explicitly relate to sexuality.
And it's, again, it's what makes the illusion of the choice so stupid at the end for Alex, because it's the difference. She's still going to be forced into a relationship. She just gets to pick her poison at that point. Like this is all very much like in a metaphorical speaking, but there's no part where she gets to say no.
Right.
There's no third option of no.
It's or at least it's very little.
It's like, you're going to have to sleep with somebody. You do it kicking and screaming, or you can do it and try and have like a good time. But you're going to have to get in the goddamn bed.
At least the British man is nice to you. Yeah,
at least the British man says he'll pay. So.
Oh, God. What a way of thinking about it.
This is what the book is saying, though.
Yeah, I know. It's just the way you said it. It was like, oh, damn.
Am I wrong?
No, you're not. No, you're not wrong. I'm just saying, like, just the straightforward way that you said it, just like sends a pang into my heart.
Like, I will be the optimist, but about the most important part of being an optimist is being honest about the situation that we're in.
Yeah,
the situation.
Exactly, for sure.
So,
all right.
For its time, I'm sure this book was very liberal and very like nice view.
It was quite acclaimed.
Yeah.
It was quite acclaimed. And again, in terms of the writing, I would think rightfully so. And like you said, there's some like interesting symbolism and imagery going on throughout the book. I think Parker knows what he's doing in this.
And it ticks all the boxes. It 100% ticks all those boxes you need to tick.
100. But yeah, you may not agree with the politics of it, the very pro-British politics, despite Parker apparently being quite sympathetic to the French Canadians. But yeah, it's sympathetic because he thought they were kind of inferior. But yeah,
it's the white man's burden.
I mean,
it's the white man's burden being done to white people. It literally goes to show like how the hoops people have jumped through. For people, it really goes to show how much it's just about proving how superior you are. Because then you can bring another white person that's probably the exact same goddamn person, but no, we're gonna categorize, we're gonna fucking itemize these. You can cut all this from the actual video. This is me going off.
No, I'm not actually going to. This is actually 100% true. Yep, we've talked about this before with the Irish.
This is straight up, as a book, the greatest thing I can compare it to is one of those movies that's Oscar bait.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that's such a good comparison.
It's like, it's 100% trying to present itself as deep and thoughtful and provocative and all these other things when it is shallow as fuck and pandering as anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, because once you get past,
and I'm sure technically speaking, it's great.
Yeah, technically speaking, again, well written and all that, but like it is just a metaphorical thing about like, oh, French Canadians and English and French. And you're like, great, cool. William Kirby also did that earlier, right? With the Golden Dog. So,
And then it came up later with, oh God, what was it?
There's a lot of them.
Give me one. Throw one out there.
Crash.
There you go. Yes, that was what I was thinking. The Crash.
Okay. All right.
Like, so I can 100% see a movie adaptation.
There is one.
No, but I mean like a modern day movie adaptation made for Oscars and all that other shit. Bring in some powerhouse names.
I don't know if it still exists, if a copy of it survived or anything like that, but there was
a 1914 silent film.
There you go.
I can do my own research. Thank you very much.
I did try looking for it because I was genuinely curious, but I couldn't find it. Yeah. Unfortunate. Anyway, I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah.
We've been talking for like an hour and a half.
And then we have our 30-minute preamble. We're like all talked out.
I'm tapped out. Yep. So
I'm tapping out.
Mac, how can remind people how they can support the show?
With smiles.
Okay. Yeah, just send an email with a smile on it. That's fine. I'm fine with that.
So reach out through our various social media pages that we don't really use. Support the show through PayPal. We have affiliate links set up for the books that we talk about, but this book is free on Project Gutenberg. That's how I didn't read it. You can support us on Patreon. You can just spread us by word of mouth. We're very much like, this is not our job. This is our hobby. And we are happy to keep doing it as such. We are happy that this just reaching out to people's voices. So if you want to just support us by spreading us through word of mouth, leaving reviews on iTunes, that's fine too. We're happy if we're happy, and we're happy just to have the little bits that we do have of ads and Patreon just helps us. We literally just go out for a nice dinner with the money we get.
That's every once in a while we're like, it's a business dinner.
Yeah, we put it in our tax receipts. Patrick gets a rebate. It's fine.
I don't think so.
No, we don't even do that. So however you want to support us, that's all. That's already okay with us. We literally just have enough money to cover our overhead with this.
No, a little bit more. But
yeah.
But yeah, and also I should send a quick shout out to another show that's related called Fireside Canada, which does all kinds of myths and short and stories from Canada, which I think you would enjoy, Mac, because it's just kind of like
campsite stories. That's true. You did a voiceover for them.
I did a voiceover for them, and yeah, you'll be able to hear me in both English and French as Wilfrid Laurier and the main character, Joseph.
Oh my God, you must have hated yourself for a hot minute. You voiced Laurier? You did a deal with the devil fun. There.
No, it was fun because I don't often get to do some voice acting, but it was a fun time.
I'd be down to do that. Give them my name.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I'll check it out. Check him out. He's great.
Check it out. Listen for Patrick.
There you go. Anything that you hear in French is me.
Yeah. Listen for, we got interviews coming on along the pipeline. Again, we do these for free. So this is just us helping out for free publicity. So keep up with that. Listen to these interviews. Read these people's books. They are more well-spoken than we are probably.
They're also just very interesting.
They are just
like the
history of film in Lethbridge, which I want to read because I have family out there.
Yeah, it's the history of Lethbridge, and the one I just did was on a famous trial in Toronto in the 1890s. So
there you go.
It's really interesting. Yep.
The things we do and talk. So I say check it out. I say keep listening if you really want to support us. That's the number one thing you can do. Just keep listening, folks.
100%.
But if you do want to listen to more episodes, we have bonus episodes on our Patreon from a series called Pop Canada, where we talk about Canadian pop culture dynamics. We talk about Cirque du Soleil, Michael Bublé. I did say it that way for the rhyme. Cirque du Soleil, Michael Bublé, Canada Day.
Christmas Day.
And since Patrick challenged me to try and find a Scooby-Doo Canadian link, we're going to be talking about Simple Plan next week, since they did the theme to What's New Scooby-Doo.
Oh my God.
Oh, I am a Scooby scholar, and this is me signing off.
Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.